Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown, a home of liberal religion. I'm the Reverend Kerry Mueller, co-minister here with the Reverend Dave Hunter in the other studio. You are most welcome here, whatever your beliefs, whatever your background, whomever you love, whether you were a longtime member, a curious visitor, or an accidental YouTube watcher. Are there announcements this morning? Okay, we'll begin with hymn number 126, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, if Carly will play it for us once. I'm sure I saw Carly, but Dave is...
I'm here.
You are, okay, number 126. We're going to do that next. Thank you. That was actually One World, This for All Its Sorrow, which in our hymnal has a newly commissioned tune, or a tune that was commissioned 25 years ago. But that's the old tune called Schmuckedeck, which means deck thy soul. Our opening words are from the poet Annie Dillard. We are here to abet creation and to witness to it, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature, so that creation need not play to an empty house. And Dave will light our chalice this morning for our universalist heritage, which reminds us that no one is outside of the grace of divine love or undeserving of human justice. Our offering words are from Robert Shabley, a UU minister who died in the last year. We drink from wells we did not dig. We have been warmed by fires we did not build. We give our gifts in thanksgiving for those who passed their light to us. And if you will find the donate button, I'm sure that you can have an opportunity to support the work of this congregation. We live together in joy and sorrow, in hope and concern. Here is a time to share the important events of your life and the life of the world. And as each of you speaks, I will drop a stone into the bowl of water to make the ripples that are symbolic of our connections to each other. Are there joys and sorrows to be shared this morning? Yes, Linda. Don't forget to unmute.
Today we're going to New Jersey. Two of my nephews are being inducted into the Marines tomorrow. So they both graduated last June. They're cousins, they're not brothers. And they ended up going off together. So hopefully it'll all work out well for them.
I certainly wish them well.
I have a joy and a concern. My oldest son apparently contracted COVID, and we're just finding out about it because he likes to manage things on his own. So what we've discovered is that he has survived the first several weeks. And apparently is waiting for the fever to go away.
Well, we certainly wish him well and
We're-
his mother's heart.
Thank you.
I have a joy. My second oldest granddaughter, Sofanisba Fernecki, has been accepted and has accepted the honor of taking part in a State Department program which will send her to Germany for her senior year in high school. This is a fairly rare honor. She's worked very hard for it for a long time. Her actual trip to Germany will depend partly on the COVID possibilities. So we'll see how that goes, but that should be an exciting time for her.
I have a concern, and it's not a big concern. When we had our last walk, UUFP walk, it was a walking club, we didn't decide where we were going next. And since I have to leave today right after the service, I just wondered if I could poll the walkers where you want to meet next. Riverside Park, because I think if I email everybody, it's going to be difficult to get the information by the time the newsletter gets out. So can I just say Riverside Park and we'll go for that? Alan, you're okay. Thank you very much.
Well, let us hold in our hearts the joys, the sorrows, the concerns of all of humanity, whether they are spoken and shared or silent and solitary. Will you join with me now in a spirit of prayer and meditation? Spirit of life. Again, the flags are at half-staff. Again and again. Again, families are in mourning, whole communities, a nation. New names are added to an endless list. We see on film young Dante Wright shot with a pistol. We learn about Adam Toledo, 13, killed last month as he appeared.
If people who are not muted could please mute.
We learn that in the last some years, 40% of the police shootings have been of unarmed Black men, who are less than 13% of the population. We are awash in the blood of innocents, victims of gun violence. Fearful police shoot people of color. Angry young men shoot for unclear reasons, and their victims are Asians or Sikhs or whoever is nearby. Death and carnage abound. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. May we take stronger action to end the tide of violence. May we learn to keep the peace without the weapons of war. May we put an end to racism. When asked how we should treat others, may we remember that there are no others. There's only us in millions of forms. May we find a way to live in the spirit of life. Amen. And now, Carly, if you'll play number 126, which is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Thank you, Carly. The reading this morning is a poem from John Donne, one that is long burned into my unconscious and probably yours. No doubt he would have used some less sexist language if he were writing today, but his message is still clear. No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So my sermon is called Who is We? And this title came to me early in my ministry, 25 years ago or more. Dave objected, of course, because we is a plural pronoun and requires a plural verb. And I responded, no, we is being used here as an indeclinable abstract noun, just like we the people is an abstract, indeclinable, as in don't tread on we the people. QED, he responded, just as I said, you can't say that. It's grammatically indefensible. And so it went. 25 years later, I can do both sides of the discussion, but the title has become irresistible. For the 4 years of the administration of the previous guy, I suffered so much anxiety about the state of the world and the state of the nation that I had to take the news in careful little doses. I knew I needed to know what was going on because at any moment we might find ourselves slimed with corruption or plunged into war or overwhelmed with economic disaster or racial catastrophe or some unimaginable crisis. But I couldn't tolerate the density of NPR. Too much information left me feeling paralyzed. TV news with a side dish of reassurance that there was another way of looking at things, that was all I could manage. My anxieties fell into 4 buckets: climate crisis, racial injustice, threats to democracy, and in the last year, the pandemic. And all of these came with potential economic disasters, exhilarating and precarious critiques and protests, a crumbling of the common reality, and an ever-present looming sense of dread. Would democracy survive? Would there be a massive population crash? Will white supremacy succeed in poisoning everything? January 6th brought some of this to a head with the insurrection at the Capitol, and then it all receded a little. The inauguration went on in a near normal fashion. Vaccines arrived. The culture began to accept that the racial reckoning as something right and long overdue. My anxiety diminished. My emotional bandwidth improved. I began to listen to NPR again, dense and detailed stories, interviews, facts, conversations. And then one day in February, that old sermon title rose up. Who is we? Who do we want to be? Story after story reminded me. They fell into all my buckets, intertwined so that climate change is exacerbated by racism, that the pandemic is filtered through racism, that embedded sexism shows up in the economy, harming families, that the fragility of democracy imperils every hope for improvements. I heard about people suffering in Texas after that terrible storm and the freeze that caused the power grid to go down, a power grid that was isolated from the rest of the country, preventing the sharing of what might have alleviated the outage. Why? Well, a smaller we allowed those in control to avoid the regulation of the larger we, and so people suffered and died. I heard about the economic fallout of the pandemic and how it was affecting women, especially women of color, that many had lost jobs, undone their careers because caregiving and householding have long been an afterthought. that the economic value of so-called women's work has not been taken into account by the whole. Women have been left to cobble together individual solutions to childcare. This was damaging enough before COVID, but when those individual solutions fell apart, mothers had to fill in the gaps, and they were left to feel that somehow as individuals, they were failing. I heard Heather McGee talk about how racism damages everyone, how laws and practices designed to disadvantage people of color, yes, hit those people the hardest, but they all fell on poor white people and the general public. Her iconic example is public swimming pools. When integration came, all of those little towns that had beautiful public swimming pools simply closed them rather than allow Blacks to use them. And so a public good was lost to everyone, and public goods in general became suspect. The pandemic itself demonstrates why we needs to be everyone. The only way to defeat the virus is to deny it a host, to reach herd immunity. Public health measures like masks and sanitation and vaccines have to be near universal to be fully effective. A sharp Facebook meme pointed out that having a mask-free zone is like having a peeing section in the swimming pool. Any place in the world that is left out of the vaccination process can become an incubator for the variants that will eventually invade the rest of the world and threaten the hard-won immunity of the vaccines. The race is not just between the virus and science, but between the virus and our willingness to widen our circle of care and concern. This isn't a matter of charity towards them, but for the health and welfare of all of us. We has to be all of us. We human beings, we of the United States, we UUs. We can't afford to be fragmenting ourselves. We can't afford to leave anyone out. We need to be whole. But it's not just the pandemic. Ongoing endemic racism has been especially overwhelming this week. Even as the trial of Derek Chauvin and the death of George Floyd had the country riveted, another police shooting of an unarmed Black man occurred not 10 miles from the site of that trial. Possibly it was a mistake, a deadly mistake, but a mistake waiting to happen in the charged atmosphere of racial anxiety, with the police and the Black community fearing and distrusting one another and everyone on edge. Daunte Wright knew the danger of a traffic stop, and he called his mother, only for her to hear his last seconds as he was shot with a gun instead of a taser. Meanwhile, we have seen the body camera footage of the death of Adam Toledo in Chicago. He never got a chance to call his mother. For communities of color, the police are likely to be at least as dangerous as any situation for which they might want to call the police. If the useful and beneficial safety functions of policing are not available to a large portion of the public, then the whole of the body politic is diminished. And for communities of color, the cost is catastrophic in terms of lives and trauma and the erosion of daily life. These losses are not good for any of us. This week, Charles Blow in the New York Times wrote about white panic as it becomes clear that the complexion of voters in this nation is growing darker. Whites are becoming a smaller percentage of the whole. Tucker Carlson, among others, has been exploiting this fact in order to frighten white voters at the expense of all of us. It's called replacement theory. Now, I do wish people would stop calling these things theories. They do not rise to the level of testable, evolving scientific theory, which would be a high bar. They are claims, notions, fantasies, not theories. But that's an aside. That's just a pet peeve of mine. Replacement claims further exacerbate the racial divide and lead to all sorts of additional inequities, fear of immigration and immigrants, all kinds of voter suppression, and daily slurs and attacks. Even the corporations are beginning to talk as if they understood that they need a small, strong democracy to thrive. This week, led by the Black Economic Alliance, hundreds of corporations, business leaders, and individuals signed a 2-page ad in the Washington Post and the New York Times in support of voting rights as the lifeblood of democracy. And I have that page here. You can see, you can't see it all at once, but there it is. A government of the people, by the people, needs to be all of the people. Now, there's a simple solution to part of this problem. It requires a communal shift in our perception of who we is. Are we the white folks fearing replacement? That has a Stepford Wives ring to it, as if each of us was going to be disappeared and replaced with a darker, more docile robot in our place tomorrow. Maybe we should think of ourselves as the whole community, all of us. We are not being replaced, but augmented, joined by others who would help us create a beloved community of justice, equity, and compassion. If there's an us and a them are the ones trying to pile advantage upon advantage on the already overprivileged. We need to shift our perception of we. Dividing ourselves up by color is foolish and unnecessary, and it diminishes the power of the people. We need a wider circle of we. Now, I'm quite certain this is possible. I've seen it happen in large and small ways. In my life, I've experienced such odd shifts at least twice. Geographically, I've lived most of my life on the East Coast of the US, and my internal default map of the world has as its center New York. That's just the way the world is. And then in my 30s, I spent a year in London, in England. My map shifted. It moved across the ocean, getting about halfway. Even my accent shifted. My native New Jersey nasal clip, which always identified me immediately as an American, it softened. People began to ask me if I was Irish. Back in Philadelphia, my map reverted to New York, but not permanently. A time in Arkansas moved the center of the world to the middle of the country. I began paying attention to tornado watches on the weather map. I began mamming everyone in the polite Southern fashion. I had a new place for we. It happened in a different way when Dave and I lived in Northern Virginia in the 80s. Fairfax County was a magnet for immigrants, often people fleeing trouble elsewhere in the world. At first, it was mainly Asians, many of them from Vietnam after the Vietnam War. Later, it was mainly Spanish-speaking people, but people from all over. I saw my kids' classmates shift. At first, they looked different. They sounded different. I heard accents. I saw a variety of races. And the foods at the potluck PTA events became more interesting and delicious. Restaurants and grocery stores from Thailand, Iran, Central and South America broadened and improved my cooking. After a few years, those kids didn't look so different anymore. They changed and I changed. My daughter and her two best friends had ancestry on at least 4 continents among them, 3 fluently spoken languages, and at least 2 religions. But their differences were overcome by their commonality. Michelle and Esther and Amanda, well, they hung out together, not because they were different or in spite of the fact that they were different, but because they were the 3 best Latin students in the school. And that's what held them together. After a few years here, the kids from somewhere else sounded just like other American teens. They carried themselves like other American teens. My internal unconscious image of we shifted. We've seen a major shift in the perception on a grand scale as well. When I was 10, word in school was that you better not wear green and yellow on Thursday because that would mark you as a fairy. I didn't know what that was, but I knew you didn't want to be it. But decades later, seemingly overnight, public opinion changed. GLBTQIA folk, they're we. Same-sex marriage? Well, of course. Now, I know that this was not, in fact, overnight, and that it has not been 100%, that discrimination and danger still exist, that the same forces that fear racial replacement are trying to exclude trans people, but there's been a major shift. We includes people of all sorts of genders and sexualities, too many and too fluid to try to pigeonhole anyone. Are we beginning to see a similar shift in our sense of racially who we are? Millions protested George Floyd's death. Many of them were white, even in isolated little towns that may never have had a Black resident. Black Lives Matter signs can be seen in many places. I heard from the marketing people here at Whitehorse Village that a prospective resident was having a tour. And as they approached an empty apartment to look at it, there in someone's garden was a sign, Black Lives Matter. I wonder what the salesperson was thinking. Oh, said the visitor, I'd like to live in a place where people think like that. So, progress, perhaps, baby steps. A shift in we would not solve everything. It would not erase the inequities of the past or restore lives lost to police violence or undo the wealth gap that has its roots in segregated schooling, redlining in real estate, employment discrimination, and so many laws and practices. In the civil rights era, those resisting change often complained that there was no point in changing laws if we didn't change the hearts and minds of the people. But laws were changed and things improved, many things did, and public opinion followed, at least in part. Maybe it's time to work more directly now on the hearts and minds again. Racial justice, climate catastrophe, threats to democracy, this pandemic, and the next one all demand it. We need to work at this question with love and grace for all. People who do not look like us, people who do look like us, people who do not think like us, and people who do think like us. We are universalists after all. It is possible to break down the barriers of the divide. The Reverend William Barber put it this way: if we do not believe in the redemption of your enemies, then you become what you hate. Who is we? We are moving to a wider, more inclusive sense of we. We is not me multiplied millions of times. We is something richer, more complex, more challenging, uncertain, filled with endless possibilities. We is filled with vigor and hope. The whole awaiting us is greater than the sum of the parts. We is all of us, so may it be. Amen, shalom, salam, and blessed be. Since we talked about baby steps, I'd like to ask Carly to play number 168, One More Step. And I've asked her to play it 4 times because in the first verse it says one more step till there's peace for all, and then one more word until every word is heard, and one more prayer until every prayer is joined, and every song until every song is sung. Number 168. Thank you. And now, Dave, if you will extinguish the chalice, we extinguish the virtual flame of this chalice, but not with the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again. And these final words from the Persian poet Hafez: we have not come here to take prisoners or to confine our wondrous spirits, but to experience ever and more deeply our divine courage, freedom, and light. Amen. Now I invite you to get your cup of coffee and we can change modes.